Hi there, and welcome back to 19th Century Art. In this lecture, we're going to look at French Romantics and their investigation of the sublime and the grotesque. As we've talked about so far, Romantic ideas about art had been investigated in Britain and in Germany, and many of them were picking up on the ideas of Shakespeare, who was immensely popular in these countries. The French didn't take to Shakespeare, so these writers, Shelley, Schiller, and Byron, all young, excitable, and fascinated with everything strange and foreign and exotic, would be the leading lights of the Romantic literature movement. The French come to Romanticism in a slightly different way. French Romanticism was really inspired a lot by the figure of Napoleon himself, who, this genius on the battlefield, cut a dramatic pose as a person who was in charge of their own destiny, not a person cut from a mold in the vein of verisimilitude, but in actuality a person of singular determination and insight into the ways of the world. And so here Antoine Jean Gros has painted Napoleon planting the tricolor on the battlefield at Pont d'Arcole in 1796. And in this painting, Antoine Jean Gros is showing us how Napoleon is this dramatic person, how he is taking charge, he is acting, he's looking back, but he's moving forward with this kind of determination, where the flag swirls past him in this dramatic way, is part of this idea of the romantic visionary, the singular man with passion and determination. So Gros was present with the army near Arcola when Bonaparte planted the flag on the bridge, and he seized on this incident and showed by his treatment of it that he had found his vocation. Bonaparte was deeply flattered and at once gave him the post of Inspector en Revue, which was a position which enabled him to follow the army and to continue to make paintings about Bonaparte. And in 1797, he was nominated him to a commission charged with selecting from the spoils of Bonaparte's many victories across Europe which art they had plundered would go back to Paris and now be ensconced in this national museum, the Louvre. And this is where and why so much excellent European art can be found there. So here's another painting on the great story of Napoleon Bonaparte. We have him visiting the plague victims of Jaffa in 1804. Again, in this exotic locale, he stands out as a man resolute, acting without fear of death, coming to deal with this crisis that has surrounded his army. And it's one of these very dramatic moments that we see this exotic locale that is used as a way to highlight what makes France, that the sort of destitute and the poisons of the Orient are here being treated by the civilizing force of the French. Another romantic style painter in France was the artist Theodore Géricault, who was from a family of tobacco merchants, and his father was determined that he follow in his trade, enter into the cigarette business, and instead of pursuing his passion as a painter. And he went off, his uncle would vouch for him, but in secret he continued to paint and study painting. He submitted this dramatic painting to the Salon, and while it was not purchased by the Academy at that Salon, he did win a gold medal for his excellence in painting. And this is a very exciting and dramatic dare I say, romantic representation of the charging chasseurs, 1812. Of course, Napoleon's armies were marching off to Russia. And so we see fierceness in the battlefield, the glowing embers, the horse rearing. And this is following in that painting of David, the horse, portrait of Napoleon crossing the Alps. Again, this very dramatic sweep of the saber, the turning back again as the horse is charging forward. There's this wonderful dynamism in this painting, and it sort of speaks to the glories, the excitement, the superhuman power of these military forces. 2 years later, at the Salon of 1814, Theodore Géricault presented a different vision of the military, one that was actually quite shocking for audiences to see at this time. This was entitled The Wounded Cuirassier Leaving the Field of Battle. And if you look at this soldier here leaving the field of battle, he doesn't look especially wounded. He's looking back over his shoulder. The war is still raging. He's obviously has this kind of scared look. He is fleeing. He is abdicating his responsibility and retreating from the field of battle. And again, this way of looking at the military here, the powerful horse rearing up, the man who looks perfectly fit, his sword in his scabbard, and he's walking off the field, looking back, a little terrified of what he's seen. So we would still call this a romantic vision in the sense that it really deals with this individual and their plight. It's contrary to the idealized vision of the military. It creates this notion of a complex idea of heroism in contrast to what it represents. Géricault would then go to Rome, and there he began a number of studies in preparation. He was deeply moved by the horse races and tried to imagine what they would have been like in antiquity. He did numerous studies of the bareback horse races of Italy in the Barbary horses on the Corso. And this is one of many paintings he did in preparation for this work. He never realized it. It's full of the kind of passions that a romantic painter would be interested in, but ultimately he could never figure out what this painting was speaking to, what it was really about. So he goes back to Paris, and in the news, he finds a story that deeply moves him. And this is the story of the raft of the Medusa. The Medusa was a ship that ran aground 4 miles off the African coasts. And the ship's captain, governor, and escaped on the first of too few lifeboats. The remaining 150 passengers made a makeshift raft. After 2 weeks, they were rescued and only 10 were left alive. Now, what happened was the captain and the governor made it back safely and said, oh, the ship cast it, everyone died, we were the only survivors. Except that story proved false when these remaining 10 that left alive. And here we see the remains of the crew of the Medusa hanging on to what is left of their miserable existence. And it's a very powerful picture. We see the sort of makeshift raft, this sail that's been pulled together, the people dying and diseased bodies laying about them, and them having been reduced to cannibalism to survive on the open waters. So this is a grisly story, but it's a story also of hope. And you see this sort of pyramid of bodies building up to this one figure standing atop, waving, hoping to be seen. And you can see just ever so slightly on the horizon this tiny representation of a ship. This is the ship that will eventually rescue them. So Géricault had the sense that this painting was not be accepted in Salon. It was very critical of the elites and the elite status in France, and the way the Navy was made up of these upper class people who had no concern for ordinary people. And that was really the heart of this story. So he takes his giant painting, which is a full 16 feet high and 23 feet and 5 inches long. He takes this massive painting to London and he puts it on display where 40,000 visitors paid to see it. Okay, so he keeps very famous and very wealthy from making this big, dramatic, romantic painting. Now, Géricault, in studies for this painting, began to go to the morgue and collect body parts and sort of check them out like a lending library. I mean, this is really a true story, folks. Hard to imagine. And there in his Paris apartment, he would paint these decaying body parts in studies for his Raft of the Medusa. I know. It's hard to imagine what lengths he would go to capture the character of dead and decaying flesh. Géricault went on to explore other aspects of dark sense of humanity. He would go to institutions for the insane, known as asylums, and there he would paint the inmates and trying to sort of capture them in their peculiar eccentricities. He had a medical friend, Dr. Girogaget, who asked to paint the portraits of people with different monomanias as a kind of clinical record and diagnostic aid, the sort of the convergence of science and artistic interests. Géricault's health deteriorates and he dies at the young age of 32. At this time, a new voice of Romanticism emerges in France. Victor Hugo, the writer, playwright, theorizes on the grotesque in 1827, and this becomes an absolute pillar of the Romantic movement, and the ideas of Romantic art are firmly established in France. On the grotesque, Victor Hugo writes, "Not everything in creation is beautiful to the human eye, that the ugly coexists with the beautiful, the deformed beside the gracious, the grotesque by the sublime, good hand in hand with evil and shadow with life." And so that was one of the things that the Romantics were trying to get at, was this sort of realistic representation of the complexity of life. Not just valor at the height of its valor, or the poverty in its most abject way. He was trying to create this complex image, this tension between the sublime, the beautiful, and the grotesque, this idea of this twisted and distorted aspects of reality. Here on the left, we see actually an ink drawing by Victor Hugo, and you can see his fascination with ruins, and this is what made him write one of his most famous books, which you probably are familiar with, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. This was an incredibly influential book, as it changed people's perception of the Gothic in France, away from this sort of dark, foreboding baggage of the past into this sublime expression of the heroic aspects of the medieval life. And it would really endear people to the Gothic and this romantic idea of ruins. Eugene Delacroix was another painter who took up the idea of Romanticism. Here is his version of a Raft of the Medusa, but instead he's returning it to the past, the story of Dante's Inferno. Here is Dante and Virgil, the Roman poet who is taking Dante on this journey to hell. and they're on this boat, and the writhing waters and the tormented souls that are floating in this hellish landscape. And this is a very dramatic, but it's still very clearly couched into this classical treatment of horror. It's not as pungent. It's not about a real event in the current times or such. It really is just trying to get this vocabulary of the grotesque into this salon. Delacroix would try a historic incident, the massacre at Chios in 1824. And again, we see this idea of an exotic locale, these languid bodies, these massacred people, and the soldiers powering through. Languid, destroyed world is part of this image of the Orient that becomes very popular. Now, when I say the word Orient, I'm really just talking about a term that refers to anything that is not Western, which was then referred to as the Occident. And so this division between the Orient and the Occident was really a kind of us and them. And there were people who studied what was the Orient. How do you geographically define something that is not really any real thing, but is actually just anything which is not European, essentially? This is what becomes the Oriental. And Delacroix was really fascinated in that exotic world. And he would go and look into this idea of the exotic Oriental on many occasions. Here is another one of his famous paintings, The Death of Sardanapalus, which is based on a play. And it was rejected at the Salon of 1828 because it didn't deal with classical themes. This is a story that was clearly set in the Orient. Sardanapalus is this Persian emperor who decides to commit suicide, and before he does, he wants to witness the destruction of all of his wealth, and which means all of his servants, all of his horses, everything he owns or has dominion over must be destroyed before him. So we see him here sort of coolly and indifferently witnessing the savage destruction of his court. And it's a powerful metaphor for the spectacular and the degradation of the Orient in its obsessive ways. And this is part of ways in which it contrasts with the sort of rational and ways of the Occident, the Western world. It's sort of as a kind of warning to what can happen with despots. Again, the metaphor and the themes are kind of messy. This is a fascinating painting for its passions, its crazy asymmetry. There's all kinds of things moving in this picture. And it really demonstrates that Delacroix really knew how to paint, but he didn't quite know what to paint. He picks up on the idea of the revolution of 1830, the July Revolution of 1830. And in this, he's celebrating the people rising up and overthrowing tyranny once again. And in this painting, he champions this woman leading the charge with her breasts bare, and you see the people coming to her strength and marching over the barricades and taking arms and reclaiming their right to self-governance. Now, what's interesting about this figure that he has here as the figure of liberty, you notice that she is wearing the hat of the freed slave, and that she is a part of the symbolism of the revolution. You see, at this time in 1820, some 11 years earlier, the figure of Venus de Milo was uncovered in Rome, and it was celebrated as an exquisite sculpture. And she becomes the inspiration for his take on the figure of liberty. So this becomes a huge success. He's awarded a prize that allows him to go to Morocco and Tangier and study the exotic Orient, which is what he really wants to paint. But his idea that this classical image of the Venus de Milo becomes the basis of this revolution. In a way, it's sort of couching neoclassicism inside Romanticism. So in Algiers, Delacroix really looks at the people of this country. And even though he's still showing his infatuation with all things exotic, there is a kind of humanity that he finds in this world. And it allows him to examine with greater specificity the lives of the people who live in what he refers to as the Orient. Now, Delacroix was not the only artist to take up this idea of the exotic East. We have our artist Jean-Auguste Dominique Ong, who would become later in life, after leaving neoclassicism for the sort of Oriental exoticism, in the Grand Odalisque, an oil painting from 1814. He's really just showing off his exceptional painting skill and his absolute love of human flesh. And this painting, with all its silks and brocades, is really a celebration of wealth and texture. He continues to paint this idea of the exotic Oriental woman in his Odalisque with a slave. And we again get some exotic treatment, the decorations and ornamentations, but did not really understand or ever visit these places he's painting. It just becomes an opportunity for him to paint languid, luxuriant, naked women. And you can see this in his later work, The Turkish Bath, where he is using this circular composition as a kind of peephole into the feminine world of the Turkish slaves of the exotic Orient. Again, these are paintings that appealed to a male audience that was excited by and fascinated by a world they barely knew and clearly did not understand.